Okay, I am Joe, and I am going to be watching and reacting and chiming in like a amateur fly on the wall of this conversation about the hard problem of consciousness with David Chalmers, Neil deGrasse Tyson, and the other guys. And I listened to this yesterday, and I just wanted to listen to it again and record my thoughts on it. I really enjoy thinking about and trying to understand consciousness. Um, and I generally think of it as a scientifically valid thing that can be studied, and I think that it comes from physical forces and not from magic land. I am essentially a materialist, and so trying to come up with a good um, definition of and operational definition that includes physical nature is fun. And so I wanted to go through this talk again and offer some of my opinions about what they're talking about and maybe try to add some questions that I would have liked to been brought up. So here we go. Star Talk. See what they
This
start off with.
is Star Talk, special edition. Neil deGrasse Tyson, you're a personal astrophysicist. I got with me Chuck Knight. Chuck, baby.
Hey, what's happening?
All right. How you doing,
Chuck
sir?
Knight.
I'm
That's his name.
good, thank you.
Gary O'Reilly. Yeah,
Gary
thank you.
O'Reilly.
And
Thank you.
love to have you as my co-host here.
Pleasure.
Yeah, we're doing yet another episode on consciousness.
Yeah,
When will we be done?
when we know what we need to know.
Okay.
And so this could be going on for a while. I mean, it's not just consciousness, it's consciousness and reality.
And our understanding and interpretation of reality
Exactly.
filtered through our consciousness.
Totally.
Okay. So what show did you
The idea that you're done with a scientific concept is not really important. I don't think that you ever really finish with things that matter, and maybe at some point our conversation around consciousness won't matter that much, but I don't know why you would be done with it. I think what he means is when will we actually have like a good answer to the question of what consciousness is and where it comes from. But he is kind of saying it like can we just be done with this? Anyway, not bad, but
cook up today?
All right, so we're heading for inner space rather than outer space.
Inner space. I love it.
And consciousness, as we just discussed. We continually think of it as, I suppose, a precious entity. We feel like we're above others on the planet, other beings.
Yes,
Say that to your cat.
I was going to say.
Don't start me on catitude. Please don't go there.
Yeah, we think we're in charge of the cats. It's the opposite.
Yeah, I mean, for hundreds and thousands of years, the greatest thinkers of
the comment about the cats is interesting because they're kind of conflating consciousness with control, and they're like tell that to your cat, like your cat's the one that's actually more conscious because it's more controlling, or it's actually manipulating. And so it's interesting to conflate the idea of manipulation or hierarchy to consciousness, like consciousness allows us to be above animals, which our type of consciousness probably does, but it's or not above them, but like to control them. Anyway, cats are, yeah, whatever.
grappled with it, they've grappled with each other as regards to explaining it. There are a handful of theories in existence, but apparently it's a hard problem, which is a clue. So what is consciousness? What makes it? Once we've conquered that particular mountain, we will dive down a rabbit hole of simulation theory, singularity, and virtual reality. It's going to be fun. And to join us, we have Professor of Philosophy and Neuroscience at NYU. He is an Australian philosopher and cognitive scientist. Also an author. Reality Plus and The Conscious Mind are two of his many books. He gave us phrases, the hard problem of consciousness and philosophical zombies along the way. Please, David Chalmers.
David, welcome back to Star Talk. And you're just down the street at NYU, New York University.
Just right up here on the C train.
Welcome.
Simplicity.
Welcome. Now, why do we need you to say that consciousness is a hard problem? Isn't that just obvious? So why do we need a decorated professor of the field to assert that?
Totally obvious. And when I first said this, I just said, okay, well, this is just giving the thing a label that everybody knows, but who was to guess that the label would catch on? Sometimes it's just helpful to say the obvious. Actually, the idea that consciousness poses a hard problem, we were talking about Newton before the show. You can actually find it in Newton. At one point he says, the way that colors mix optically and produce a certain experience is not so easy. This he says is not so easy. EASIE, and he says it's the way that we understand this stuff objectively and say how the brain processes visual inputs, but then it gives you the experience of a color. That amazing pink shirt.
Yeah, go coral.
Yeah. Okay.
Yes. Magenta.
Yeah. Where does that
It's
experience
definitely not
of pink
magenta.
come from?
It's-
As Newton said, not so easy.
King salmon, not farm raised.
King salmon.
Yeah.
You've reduced me
Wow,
to
that is kind of king salmon.
Right.
Good for you. Wild
salmon.
caught.
Yeah, wild caught.
reduced me to food stuff.
Where does the experience of king salmon come from? Envision, that is what Newton said. It's not so easy.
Okay, so David, had you instead called it the easy problem of consciousness, maybe we would have all figured it out by now. But
Well,
not-
the easy problems were the problems of things you do, like how people respond, what they say. I
All
can
right, so
say
what is consciousness? Put it on the table.
subjective experience.
There we go.
Consciousness is anything you experience directly from the first person point of view. I think of it like the inner movie of the mind. It's a movie, but it's got images and sounds like a regular movie, but it's got sensations of your body. It's got smell. It's got taste. It's got emotions. It's got thinking, all running through this inner soundtrack of your mind.
And that'll
I like his practical definition of consciousness. I like that it's simple and that it involves senses and it involves just like the inner workings of the kind of he calls it a movie that's playing in your head. I think it's like a it's like a four-dimensional movie where time can be altered and it's in three-dimensional space inside your head. It's not a two-dimensional movie. So I think that's all very good. I think one of the things I would add to the definition of consciousness is the stream of consciousness, which he said there as thoughts, but I think a great deal of what consciousness is our internal monologue and our internal verbal encoding of the world. So we have a sensation and we immediately encode it into language, and I think that language is probably one of the primary characteristics of consciousness, internal generation of language as well as the internal observation of language. We don't just talk, we actually talk and listen to ourselves, and that kind of dual internal process is a lot of what we use to explain what we're thinking. then I think we also think in visual space and in emotional space, but in order to communicate that with ourselves, to understand it, and to model the world, we need a type of symbol system, which is essentially language, as well as literal symbols. And language is symbols. We actually get so good at creating the visual symbols in our head that um, the layer that the evaluative layer that generates those symbols actually just becomes um, uh, almost invisible language, as in you don't really think about all the letters and shapes when you become sophisticated with language inside your head, but they are there. You are using visual representations of language when you think inside your head. You're just not really thinking about the symbols. You're thinking about the what they represent, which is what consciousness is as well, which is a type of internal modeling and internal or maybe consciousness gives you access to the internal modeling and internal representation system in the mind. Anyway,
allows your consciousness to be distinct and unique from others, because the world as you receive it could be very different from how someone else receives that very same world.
Sounds like a problem. That sounds like a problem to me.
But is this where biases come in the terms of how you receive and accept any information that comes to you?
We all experience it subjectively in a different way. Some things may be in common. Maybe when we look at an image, the shape, maybe our experience of that rectangle might be the same, but the emotions that it brings on may be totally different for me and for you.
Now, suppose we're running that same input through a measurement device, and then the device comes up with a conclusion. And no matter how you put the information through, it reaches the same conclusion. Yet somehow when we look at it, we see something different. Who do you trust then?
The person or the device?
Yes.
I don't know if the device is like specialized. It's a thermometer.
Right.
It says
Let's say it's a thermometer.
It says 79 degrees. I'm going yes.
I'm going with the device.
I'm going with the device too.
We're sitting together here. I get this, but I'm going with the device. Okay.
Me too. It's like, you tell me it's 79 degrees. No, I'm going to trust a thermometer.
There's a famous quote: "No science achieves maturity without a system of measurement."
Ooh.
This is where the idea of objectivity comes into play. It's very easy to rely on intuition and experience, and the conclusions that we come up with oftentimes are we're confident about them, but we can be incorrect, and that's why using external measurement systems and sharing those systems and creating standards and collaborating with other people is how you get to a level of objectivity that creates better certainty, better prediction, and better confidence. And that's why science, with the combination of tools and logic, allow people to accomplish way more than with simple conjecture and assumptions and intuition, because they can be replicated and predicted, and the measurement systems get more sophisticated and more accurate and more precise, and we become better off for it. So that is a good thing.
And we do not have the measurement system for consciousness, actually.
Which renders it immature scientifically relative to other fields where you have petri dishes and methods and tools. So you have hard problem.
Well, how about that?
Oh my God! We just proved that it was hard. Oh my God! I walked into that, didn't I?
You know, years ago, I went along to a conference and told everyone that I'd invented a measuring device for consciousness, the consciousness meter, made with a combination of neuromorphic engineering, transpersonal psychology, and quantum gravity. And then I pulled out my consciousness meter, and it looked kind of like a hairdryer. That was where we were back in the 90s.
Yeah, I would have called bullshit on your second half of that first sentence.
It sounded like word salad, so I applaud you, sir.
Yeah.
So,
Before they get into the next section, the problem with studying consciousness is that it doesn't have a rigid and measurable definition, because the evidence for it, if you were to measure it, would come from the acknowledgement of a subject identifying that it does match what they are thinking. Although there are scanning tools and brain imaging tools that they'll talk about with the correlates of consciousness that are getting to the point where they are being able to read the brain more accurately, more precisely, and linking the activity of the brain with the subjective experience. If consciousness is just subjective experience, then it has to, in order to observe it from the outside, it has to link up precisely with the person's report of their subjective experience. And so if you can figure out exactly which processes are solely responsible for the subjective experience portion of brain activity, then maybe you'd be able to scientifically study it.
whereabouts
It's like
in
the
the brain?
ectoplasmic meter.
Yeah, the ectoplasms. Yeah.
So, whereabouts in the brain do you think we are fermenting this consciousness?
Well, this is one of the big debates which is going on. What are the neural correlates of consciousness, which is the bit of the brain which is active in a way which is most directly connected to your consciousness? And there's actually, even among neuroscientists, there's a very lively debate between people who think it's in the, say, for visual consciousness, people who think it's in the sensory areas
Like
toward
the
the back
cortex
of
in
the
the back
brain,
of the
exactly,
brain.
visual cortex back there, or prefrontal cortex, front of the brain, the areas associated more
Higher
with
reasoning.
thinking and judgment.
Just a question: what's the difference between?
One of the things
Oh,
I
shit.
tell young
An
men,
ad.
well, and young women as
Let's
well.
watch this
but
ad.
young men really need to hear this more, I think.
What about
You should
young
be
men?
a monster. Absolute
You should
monster.
be a monster.
And then you should learn how to control it.
That's the problem with
So
fucking
a
Jordan
man who's
Peterson.
capable
Let's
of aggression, but has it under
the man that is capable of aggression. I think what he means is a man that is, because who isn't capable of aggression? Anyone who's proactive in the world is essentially being aggressive in some manner. But I think what he means is a man that can be aggressive toward a goal that has value is a proper and natural way to exist. Anyway, let's listen to the rest of it real quick.
control. Is a way more useful man than
It's really interesting that he's like, a man who can be aggressive and can control it is way more useful. Fucking duh. Like, of course, someone who has control over something is more useful than someone who doesn't have control over it. So it's not very insightful. I think what he means is men that are weak and men that are not proactive and seeking to alter their environment end up suffering and not being good contributors to a society, which is true.
one who cannot do that. And so you're willing to go get a job, but you're terrified of an interview. It's like, there's a dragon for you. Because you want to fight the dragons that guard the gates of the treasure that you wish to attain.
Fight the dragons. It's interesting because it's a highly metaphorical way of saying in order to achieve your goals, you have to work toward them, which has always been the case and not a new thought. But by making it a bigger than life story, he makes it entertaining and uses archetypes like heroes, like you're slaying dragons, but to equate small proactive actions and big proactive actions, I don't think is super helpful. I think that there are much bigger challenges in life and much smaller challenges in life. And for some people, the smaller challenges are harder than for others. But I don't think it's important to emphasize and to make small things really big things. Although if you treat small things like they're really important, you might become more stressed about them and work harder to achieve them. But you may be experiencing more stress than you need because that item might not actually be that important. So anyway, he talks about things very interestingly.
The productivity requires aim, orientation, responsibility, discipline, that willingness to work, that willingness to make sacrifices, which is the hallmark of maturity in the service of a higher goal. It orients you solidly in the world if you do that, and it gives you a dragon to fight.
Yay. Okay, I'm done with that.
Your prefrontal cortex and your frontal cortex.
Frontal cortex is a little bit more.
It's a little less front than the prefrontal cortex. See?
It's less front.
It's a little less front than the prefrontal cortex.
Okay. When we look at brain structures compared among other animals, let's say mammals, to keep it in the family, presumably we have a bigger frontal cortex than other mammals, and we can see what's going on in that, and thereby decide that we have certain capacity for thought that other animals do not. Is that a fair way to say
And
it?
people who put consciousness in prefrontal cortex are probably going to say that consciousness is not so widespread in the animal kingdom. Whereas people who think it's in the sensory cortices, we get those throughout the animal kingdom.
Right.
So maybe much, like, is a fish conscious? Well, fish don't have any kind of developed prefrontal cortex.
Yeah, I'm going to say, judging from the look in their eyes, I'm going to go out on a limb and say no.
Well, they know when a shark's around.
Right. Well, that's true.
Well, I have a
Move up.
question. Can you tell me what creates?
Sharks or fish don't always know when fish don't always get out of the way of sharks. Fish sometimes just swim around sharks. So many prey animals are not proactively defending themselves.
Consciousness. Is it emergent in our...
So he's going to start talking about emergence. Let's look up what emergence is. Emergence. Emergence is a process of coming into view or becoming exposed after being concealed. I misjudged the timing. Yeah, that's like to emerge out from a corner or from underneath something. The process of coming into being or of becoming important or prominent. The emergence of the environmental movement. There should be more definitions here. There's also, let's do emergence in science, maybe? Phenomenon where complex systems exhibit new properties of behavior that cannot be predicted or fully understood by examining individual components alone. Essentially, the whole system behaves differently than the sum of its parts. Here are some examples. Water. The wetness of water is an emergent property arising from the interactions between numerous water molecules. Also, wetness is not just about water, it's about its interaction with materials. So something that is hydrophobic doesn't become wet just because water is involved, whereas a towel becomes wet because it absorbs water. Which, if you take a single H2O molecule, you can't find wetness there, and so it is emergent from uh, quantities and interactions. Ant colonies, the complex behavior in an ant colony, like building a nest, is emergent property from the interactions between individual ants. Consciousness, some scientists consider consciousness to be emergent property of the brain arising from the complex interactions between neurons. I don't see how it would be anything other than emergent, and emergent isn't special or magical. I think the idea that when individual components interact, something different comes out of that is just a very normal, natural thing to exist, and we can see examples of it all the time. Weak emergence, when the emergent property can be understood by analyzing the system's components and their interactions, even if complex calculations are needed. And strong emergence, when the emergent property is completely novel and cannot be fully explained by the individual components, raising philosophical questions about the nature of reality. A lot of how you determine whether something is weak or strong would be if you can simulate it. If you can simulate, then it means you understand how the individual components work. And then if you can simulate exactly the interactions, then you, well, I guess that doesn't, I guess that helps you with determining if it's strong or weak, but because maybe the outcomes are wholly different than you would expect, and you need a new analytical system to deal with the emergent behavior. One of the examples that I like is when flocks of birds create different patterns, shapes, and movement systems. Those are dictated by reactions from individual birds with each other, but they also relate to the motivation of moving at all. So if birds are flying south or moving in a flock, maybe to get to a new area for breeding or for feeding, they all have a similar goal or are inclined toward movement, and then the way that they get there emerges from individual interactions, which if you just had one bird, you wouldn't be able to predict what would happen with all the other birds. But once you have all the birds, you can analyze how they interact with each other. So that's emergence, roughly speaking.
Genetic code. I mean, emergent in the
I'm going to go back a second because he said something there.
I'm gonna go out on a limb and say no.
Well, they know when a shark's around.
Right. Well, that's true.
Well, I have a
Roll up.
question. Can you tell me what creates consciousness? Is it emergent in our genetic code? I mean,
I think he means emergent from the genetic code. Things emerge from things, not in them.
emergent in the evo bio sense, where you have an organism that has certain properties, but
Oh, he means does
Only
consciousness
either
emerge?
en masse with other animals, like flocking
Does
of
it
birds,
evolve?
or some other feature that was not really intended. It just emerged from other features that were necessary for survival. So is consciousness emergent, or do you think it specifically evolved?
Ooh.
Those are not good dichotomies to say, is it emergent or did it specifically evolve? It specifically evolved because we have it, and it evolved like anything else evolves out of chance and mutation and adaptation. But then the question of its emergence is, can it be explained as a higher order output of individual behaviors? And I don't see how it wouldn't be that, personally, because our brains are massive systems of interactions. And so within those interactions are individual cells, but those individual cells reach out and communicate and react, and those are very difficult to map. But the output of that is, I think, novel and emergent. I don't know how else it would arise.
In some sense, emergent. I mean, this word emergence gets used in so many different ways, and sometimes it's like magic word. It's like don't really understand it. So I'll
anything
say
we don't know.
I'll say it's emergent.
I like magic words. Give me my magic word for the day.
In some sense, consciousness clearly emerges from the brain. You get a brain that develops, and consciousness comes along. As the brain develops, consciousness gets more and more complex. So there's some kind of connection there. But can we tell a story about how consciousness was selected for in evolution? No one has a good answer to that right now. There are ideas out there. Yeah, we needed consciousness for control, for decision making, for reflection. But so far, no one has told a good story about why you need to have consciousness to do those things. Why couldn't a big, complicated computer do that without consciousness?
Sometimes it's hard not to make consciousness into a similar term like intelligence. But if consciousness is the ability to create an internal model of the world and observe it internally, and to encode that model with, in humans it would be language, in other animals it might be purely um, visual, which language is visual, so it's really just visual, or representative in the brain, then it's obvious why it would be beneficial to be able to model and evaluate the model before having to go through a risky um, a risky attempt at learning, or learning wouldn't be really possible without some type of an internal modeling system. And being able to predict the future is why that would be beneficial. That seems pretty straightforward. I guess they're thinking, because if people are the only thing that are conscious, then animals learn and do it without consciousness. But I don't think that's true. I think it's just on a scale of complexity of consciousness, which also is a complexity of language and representation ability. So the idea that you would be conscious and that would offer you a survival benefit seems really straightforward. Anyway.
Is it really consciousness, or are we talking about levels of consciousness? Because I think that, there are definitely animals that have consciousness. I mean, a dog, for instance, you see it has emotion. You see that it has a reaction to sensory data.
I think it's interesting when they talk about emotion here with animals. Animals display reactions, and the emotion that they have, we sort of personify and try to understand and try to interject our own experience on animals. And so when an animal is like happy or sad, I think that we're mostly projecting our own concepts of emotions. But obviously animals get afraid, and I think that's an easy emotion to identify in animals, when they cower or submit or lash out. But it's interesting to link consciousness with emotions when they're somewhat separate ideas.
Data, just like we do. You see that it responds to commands and pain and everything. But you look at a baby, and if you didn't know if you never saw a baby before, and you saw this thing, this glob of human thing, just sitting there, like making these crazy faces, has no control of its limbs, or you wouldn't necessarily say, well, that's a conscious thing.
I'm pretty sure babies have control over their limbs. They not necessarily control in that they have free will, but I think you develop free will over time, or you develop self-control over time as well. But it's interesting he's talking about like a dog is really obviously conscious, but a baby isn't. Like, why would that be the case? Babies start to encode language very early, and babies start to predict the future very early, and babies are immediately communicative with their parents or with those around them, and so attributing some level of consciousness or pre-consciousness, and they will become conscious. So I don't know. I don't like that as an example. I would say the differences are better between like plants and animals, or between bacteria and animals. Like bacteria probably are not conscious because it doesn't seem like they are predicting the future as much as just simply reacting to immediate environment. It doesn't seem like bacteria are planning their lives out particularly.
It's actually thinking about anything. You know.
But you are totally right. There are levels of consciousness in babies, and we're still arguing about what they are. I mean, a long time ago, people used to not give anesthetics to babies when they were getting circumcised because they thought they couldn't feel pain.
Tell me about it. No, I'm joking.
Why?
I remember that day well, sir.
These days, we think babies feel pain, and we think they can have some basic visual experience. Actually, my wife, who works on this stuff, Claudia Passos.
We think babies feel pain. I'm pretty sure if you pinch a baby, they start crying. I don't know what that would be.
Leading expert on consciousness in infants. There's still an argument, like, can a baby have the experience of thinking,
right,
of deciding, of agency? The general moral, from what I can tell for the last few years, is babies are a whole lot more sophisticated than we thought they were.
David, isn't that true for every single animal that...
This is where I would interject the development of language, because babies start to create representatives in their mind before they're able to communicate complexly. That's why you can teach babies sign language early on, because it's their ability to create internal models and concepts and differentiation between representations exists well before their ability to physically speak. And so you can teach babies sign very, very early, simple, more and eat, and that, I think, indicates that there's a lag between or there's a lag between our ability to recognize consciousness and its existence, but also that it almost entirely depends on communication. Linguistics and internal representations being able to be externally communicated is a necessary component of our ability to attribute consciousness to something, which is why it's very difficult to understand and to attribute consciousness to animals, because they don't have the same linguistic communication system that we do, and we haven't learned how to understand their language. And I think animals definitely have languages, and some more complex than others, and probably none as complex as ours, but that language system is a good indicator of the ability to create streams of consciousness that are internally observed, creating a subjective experience.
That we've studied in more depth than in the past. We are recovering greater levels of neuro complexity in their conduct behavior that any previous generation thought. Is that true for every animal?
Yeah, this is absolutely the trend to say over the years, we have thought more and more animals are more and more cognitively complex.
Right.
As to the question of whether they're conscious, we used to think, okay, humans, a few primates, monkeys, apes. These days, it's like pretty much every mammal, probably birds, probably reptiles. We're arguing about fish and octopus.
It sounds like we're clawing our way out of our own ego,
Exactly.
right?
How about that?
But the singularity of our presence in the animal kingdom
Right.
is being challenged by further research into the conduct of animals. You've seen that YouTube video of the magpie bird, where it's got the container of water that's filled up to the top, and it drinks the water until it can't. The beak can't reach the water anymore. It walks away, comes back with a pebble, drops the pebble in,
raise the level of
raises
water.
the level, and then it drinks.
Right.
And it does that 3 or 4 times.
So it has a clear understanding of volume displacement.
It has a clear understanding of Archimedean principles.
But go back to Chuck's point about levels of consciousness. When we sleep, when we're unconscious, when we're in a coma, and if you put us under general anesthetic, do we not have varying levels of consciousness at different times?
The idea behind an anesthetic is to wipe out consciousness completely. But
And does it?
Very hard to test whether it absolutely does this. At one point in the 1970s, for example, people put some kind of a rubber band around the arm so the anesthetic didn't make it that far. And then they said, if you hear me, please move your hand. And what do you know? The hand could move. So then it's like that kind of anesthetic was maybe working partly just to paralyze you. These days, okay, they work a lot harder to knock out not just action, not just but pain and awareness. But it's hard to know that it's gone for sure. Even when we're asleep, when we're dreaming, there's certainly a level of consciousness.
Absolutely.
Of consciousness there.
But isn't our consciousness altered in our dreams?
A different state of consciousness for sure. Psychedelics, they alter your consciousness. Meditation, it alters your consciousness.
Absolutely. Yeah.
I'm so glad we have science to obtain an objective reality of the world. If it all depended on the human brain, forget it. We'd still be in the caves. Did I just insult your entire field?
No, it's okay.
Okay.
But, we can study what's different in the brain in these different states of consciousness, and that is one of the most exciting advances over the last 30 years. I mean, psychedelics used to just be, oh my God, it's all just,
Right, I'm just
mystical
look at the colors
wondrousness.
and
Now we can actually see what's happening in the brain when you take a psychedelic.
So, David, you published a paper recently on AI and consciousness. What was that?
Yeah, I got invited to give a talk actually to all the AI people at their big annual conference on this controversial issue of whether current AI systems could be conscious. I called it, could a large language model be conscious? And I argued that even
Large
if
language model like ChatGPT.
LLM.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And I argued probably they're not conscious right now, but give it 10 years and they may well be.
Yeah, or they're conscious right now, and they're just not letting us know.
Yeah, good strategy. Yeah, just waiting to take
Just
over
waiting
the
to
world.
take it over, babe.
Yeah.
What are we if we don't have consciousness, but we're still doing and being? And you've coined the frame philosophical zombies. Is that what that's leading to?
I think, therefore, I brains.
Okay, I'm gonna bring up a couple of articles that I have ready here that I've written or that I've got on my website. This is his David Chalmers talk on philosophical zombies. It's super duper long, so we're not going to go into it, but it's definitely a good video. Philosophical zombies is actually, let's get him to talk about that more, and then I'll talk about it more.
This is a philosophical thought experiment about a creature which is as much like us as possible, but lacks consciousness entirely. Not quite.
That's, I think, my biggest problem with the concept of philosophical zombies. It's really just accepting that people have subjective experience and that we don't have access to it other than through their report of it. And the idea is that maybe there isn't what would it be like if there wasn't a subjective experience in one person, but there was in another? But the idea that we're all the same except for this one thing is weird, and I don't know how it helps anything. I don't really get how, it's an interesting thought experiment, but it doesn't get you anywhere, and it doesn't illuminate anything other than the already existing problem that we don't have access to other people's subjective experience.
Quite like the zombies in the Hollywood movies, because they behave quite unlike us, and maybe they even have some conscious experiences when they eat their victims' brains. I love the taste of those brains. But so the philosophical zombie, one way to think about this is just say you had a computer simulation of your brain in your body and maybe behaving just like you. Would it be conscious? It's not obvious.
This might be the best boot that Thursday Boots has ever made.
Who gives a shit about
Tobacco
Thursday
Storm
Boots?
King Captain by Thursday Boot Company.
Many people think that such a creature would have no conscious experience at all. And then that kind of is a way to, it's a hypothetical thought experiment. But what it does is raises the question, why aren't we zombies? Evolution produced us based on all the smart and sophisticated things we can do. Why couldn't evolution just have produced philosophical zombies that act like us?
Well, we actually have
no
produced,
consciousness.
we have produced the zombies the way you're talking about in AI. When you can speak to an AI now via computer, like, so you don't know you're talking to an actual computer, and it will speak to you as if it were a person. You would not know that the thing you're talking to doesn't have.
Well, that's the Turing test.
Right.
That's precisely the Turing
AI
test.
systems are getting very, very close to passing that Turing test.
By the way, 50 years ago, they already said it passed the Turing test and then moved the goal lines. So the goal lines have been systematically getting moved to greater and greater complexity before anyone decides that AI has achieved consciousness. But it would have blown away Alan Turing, even the first round, because I'm old enough, we're about maybe the same age-ish. Eliza, do you remember Eliza was one of the first computer programs that understood language.
Simulated a psychotherapist.
Yes, yeah, basically your therapist. You type in the commands, there was no audio back then, so you just type it in. Say, hi, Eliza, how are you? I'm fine. Tell me about yourself. Well, I left home, 5 years ago. Tell me about your parents. So Eliza would come back to you with these questions.
I think Eliza was a decision tree system wherein it would have a limited number of responses to certain inputs, as opposed to modern AI, which uses an algorithm that guesses at the most likely best next word to add when it responds. It's generating sequences of responses that are consistent with its training, and because it trains on so much information, it has a lot of options. Anyway.
To get you to loosen up and talk about your psychological state.
Like a real therapist.
Like a real therapist.
Joseph Weizenbaum, who invented Eliza, the story goes that his secretary talked to Eliza over her lunch break, and at the end of it said, "This is the first person who's ever really understood me."
Wow.
Oh, no.
Wow, she needed more friends.
You're on record as saying the language AI will probably gain consciousness within 10 years. Is that shrinking, that timeline?
It is, as they're doing more and more impressive things.
What is it about it that does not count as consciousness today, that you're waiting for it to do in the future? Again, I'm tracking the goal lines that are continually moved forward.
I think this is a really good question, which is, if we're ascribing consciousness to everything and we don't have a good definition of it, we can just say it is or it isn't, it kind of doesn't matter, then what are we saying when we say it isn't consciousness? It doesn't have consciousness, or it isn't using consciousness. And if the definition relies around subjective experience, and that subjective experience is internally recognized utilizing some type of inaccessible to other people stream of consciousness or thinking, like which is typically verbal or linguistic, or at least representative, then AI system could be conscious. We wouldn't know because we don't have any way to test it. But even if it said it was, but if it is having an internally generated series of essentially internal dialogues where it's making assumptions, making assertions, and deciding as to the validity of those things, and doing what we do inside of our heads when we're thinking, or when we're making decisions, or when we're contemplating, or when we're observing, then it would be conscious, unless you require something additional to the definition. That being said, I wrote an article, How to Create Consciousness in AI, where I tried to think of like what would be the simplest way to just force an AI system to be conscious, and it would just have 2 layers of language models that interact with each other. And one is a purely internal language model that can only interact with itself, essentially, and that language model would have dialogue with itself, and then it would be able to have an outer layer of language model that would interact with people, so, or with other, anything that can understand its language. So I don't think it would be that hard to force a system that does something similar to our system by forcing it to have an internal subjective thinking mechanism, like essentially like to create a stream of consciousness, or a stream of questions and answers and assertions and contemplations and predictions and assessments, but as long as that is not accessible to anyone outside the system, without an executive system that decides what gets communicated outwardly, I think that's what we're doing inside our heads mostly. We think about something, and then most of the time we go, should I communicate that externally or leave it inside? Should I express these thoughts and feelings and emotions, or should I edit them for social purposes or for comprehension purposes? And if you put that into an AI system using large language models, and you could have the problem is what starts the process of the internal question answer dialogue. Or just dialogue in general, because it doesn't have to be a question; it could just be a statement. Like if the system can just generate statements, it would also have to be able to have input of the environment. So a lot of what we're doing in our minds is assessing the environment and responding to input. So like if the weather gets cold, we think in our heads about weather and about climate, or about our feelings about it, whether we're cold or something, and then we generate these internal dialogues about putting on a coat, or something like that. So it would have to have access to the external world, which large language models don't have, or AI doesn't have access to the external world, doesn't have inputs, sensory inputs. But if you could give it an eyeball and a temperature gauge, which would be pretty easy, then it could try to assess the world and have an internal communication about it that it then edits for external consumption. This is my article on how I think that might work.
So tell me.
It's very close, at least, to passing the Turing test. They've done some actual versions of the Turing test, just 5-minute versions, and people take some versions of GPT-4 to be human more than 50% of the time. So getting close to passing a Turing test. That's behavior. I think we're still looking for a couple of things in the internal dynamics of these
whether
systems.
it can beat us at Jeopardy and Go and chess? Oh, it already did that.
Yeah. We do move the goalposts.
Those aren't internal conceptions that he's talking about. I'm sure he's talking about what I'm talking about, which is what's going on inside. Is it having subjective experience? And there's no reason to think large language models have anything subjective going on. All they have, that's why it's easy to mix up consciousness with intelligence. Intelligence seems like the ability to communicate, the ability to answer questions, the ability to access information and consolidate it into something comprehensible. And that isn't consciousness. That is a type of logical processing that computers can do.
Look, I tell you,
You're constantly moving the goalpost. Admit it.
I did my PhD in an AI lab 30 years ago. If you'd told us then
That's what I'm
that we
saying.
would have systems that can carry on a conversation like this, we'd say conscious for sure.
That's what I'm saying.
Please don't hit
I'm sorry.
the
I'm
gas.
sorry.
He's just letting me know that I'm conscious.
Tell me about these goalposts. What new goal line is not yet reached?
I think people look at the internal processes in these current AI systems and they say, do they have what goes along with consciousness in a human? For humans, we think, for example, feedback processing is super important for consciousness to get some kind of reflection on your earlier states and so on. Right now, in these
Introspection.
language models, it's all feed forward. Yeah, introspection, for example, is one of memory. Even any form of memory would require basically feedback. These language models are essentially feed forward systems. Information gets passed from input to output. Doesn't circulate back very much.
It doesn't need to circulate because it has access to all knowledge. So
That's true.
So it has.
But it's just not true. Access to all knowledge is just the ability to differentiate relevant information. But to do a feedback would be to say, what can I do with this access? Am I doing a good job of evaluating and creating relevant information or relevant access to it, or am I pulling relevant items? So I don't like that he's like, it doesn't need to introspect. It doesn't need to. It doesn't introspect. It's not programmed to introspect, and there's no mechanism for it to house that introspection. But the introspection is the consciousness. That's subjective. That's the part that we're talking about. So what he's talking about is intelligence, and intelligence is not the same thing. That's why it's artificial, because it's man-made, and so it's an interesting equivocation that I don't like.
Bypassed even that is a need. So now you can't fault it for not needing what you need, what we need to declare ourselves conscious when it doesn't even need that.
But people say that at least opens up the possibility now that since it's doing it in a way which is unlike the way that we do it, and that we are the one case we know of, humans are the one case we know of that are conscious, then maybe this could be doing it in a sufficiently different way that it's a philosophical zombie. We are right now the benchmark for consciousness because humans are the only system we know.
Okay, so you can call it philosophical zombie rather than a higher consciousness entity.
And where does perception come into this?
What is higher consciousness? It's like saying that we've evolved to be higher than anything else. It doesn't make any sense to me. There's no higher level of consciousness. If you have an operational definition of something, it either is that or isn't that. It's not better or worse. If it's on a scale of complexity, then it's the way that you would describe it would be different, but it doesn't mean that it's higher. I don't really get the idea of a higher level of consciousness. I think that's more of a spiritual concept. And I think he's talking about intelligence anyway. He's not talking about consciousness. He's talking about a higher level of intelligence, which is the ability to have more information and to have access and to pull relevant information out is a type of intelligence. So anyway.
Because that's where we kind of started.
He said
Computers
perception.
don't perceive; they actually
It's a
observe.
huge part.
Like even if we did have
our
all the
experience.
knowledge in the world capable of running through our brains, each one of us would experience that differently based on the perceptions that we have of who we are, our relationship to the world, and our relationship to the information that we're receiving.
I declare
That's
that
very
we
true.
think of, I don't want to speak for you, but typically we speak of consciousness as a feature, not a bug of human existence, a feature. And so something to be praised that other animals do not have. And in the example you're giving, AI is not susceptible to perception.
Correct.
Why do we now deny it a yet higher level of consciousness and say, yeah, it's got us beat?
You're saying that that's a benefit, that to be in a position
I don't want to say,
where
oh, you're still not conscious
It doesn't.
because you're not susceptible to errors of interpretation as we are. Back in
But it's not that it's not susceptible to errors of interpretation. It's that it's completely limited to its own lack of perception. And because we have perception, we have sensory inputs, it doesn't have that. So there's no way to assess its consciousness if we define it as internal experience, because our internal experience requires these external perceptions that get interpreted, then it's not a higher level of consciousness. It just is completely lacking what we have defined consciousness as.
my office here, I have a replica of Van Gogh's Starry Night.
Yes.
So if Van Gogh himself had been AI, it would have been an exact representation of the scene in front of him in 1889.
Right.
Okay, and it's not.
Right.
It's what that scene felt like to him.
Right.
So I'll give you that.
It's not just what the scene felt like to him. It was an artistic representation of something he could do, wanted to do, had access to the materials to do. Bringing art into it is a whole nother complex thing to think about. Also, AI doesn't view the world and then create art. It takes a library of things that someone else gave it and then picks it apart by its categories of pieces. It divides it into pieces that it then recombines to generate something similar but novel. Anyway,
AI is not going to do that unless we tell it.
Right, and that's my point.
We can train it on Van Gogh, and it can give you all the Van Gogh paintings you like.
But then it is an exact representation of Van Gogh. He wouldn't have made that out of whole cloth.
Yeah.
Okay.
Can we infer consciousness on AI until we absolutely know how to define consciousness itself?
Thank you.
no.
And to have
No,
some
we
kind of
fucking
operational
can't.
criteria. The funny thing is, our best operational criterion for consciousness in humans, at least, is verbal report.
Right.
To know whether someone's conscious, you ask them.
You ask them.
To know what they're conscious of, you ask them.
What I think.
So what
you
is
know
it?
I am.
Right, I'm feeling.
I think verbal reports are how we have access to a person's communication of their consciousness. But consciousness is not just, it's not their communication of it. It's the actual internal subjective experience. We just happen to use communication to explain what that experience, how that experience represents itself. And so there's always a like a copy being made of our internal experience when we communicate it. It's being interpreted. It's being condensed and manipulated for external consumption. The actual internal experience can be frenetic and chaotic and or boring or layered or because it's subjective and it's oftentimes verbal or linguistic or utilizes internal dialogues, it can be very confusing and very very contradictory. And so the thing that we're calling consciousness is a thing that's happening in the head or in the mind, and the body is involved. And then we communicate that outwardly and we report things about it. But we're always editing the actual conscious experience and attempting to either be more or less honest about it or more or less accurate about it. But because it's always an after thing, it isn't a perfect representation of the actual conscious experience. But he's right in that the communicated report of the subjective experiences is what we have from the outside of that other person. But from the inside, as a person, you have the experiences. You can interpret them and try to evaluate them internally, but that internal process is what we're talking about.
Yeah,
Therefore I am. But in an AI system, the current AI systems, unfortunately, this has become useless as a criterion because, yeah, sure, they will tell you that for a while they were all going around saying they were conscious, and then for a while the tech companies made sure they didn't say that. So then they said, I am merely a language model from OpenAI. But anyway, this is now just a function of how they're trained.
So Neil tells us everything is mathematics.
Yeah.
So are we going to find ourselves with a T-shirt equation that can solve consciousness? I mean,
for a lot of people, this is one of the potential holy grails here, finding laws of consciousness so simple, we could write them on the front of a T-shirt, and maybe with some beautiful mathematical expression.
So we've had our...
Oh. And...
Black cult spreads through Gotham like a plague.
No thanks.
Einstein give us the theory of relativity and change the way we see the universe, right, and things within it. Penrose has gone into quantum mechanics with this
I'm going to use the restroom real quick. I'm going to pause this real quick. All right, back to it.
Some beautiful mathematical
so we've had Einstein give us the theory of relativity and change the way we see the universe, right, and things within it. Penrose has gone into quantum mechanics with this OR theory of his.
How was Roger Penrose, a theoretical astrophysicist, how was he received in your community when he published his book on consciousness, linking it to the quantum?
Well, it was very helpful in some ways. It got a lot of very smart people interested in consciousness.
Because it wanted to anchor it in laws of physics. Yes.
Yeah. His approach was to bring in quantum mechanics and furthermore, non-standard quantum mechanics, non-algorithmic versions of quantum mechanics that went way beyond what was, consensus even in physics. Then he combined it with some complicated biology, like the biology of microtubules in the cell walls of neurons, very controversial in neuroscience. So I would say, look, it's creative, it's brilliant because it's Penrose, but it's totally speculative, totally controversial, and ultimately not well received by neuroscientists. But, the neuroscientists...
Not just because he's an outsider, but because they actually did a legitimate analysis.
They said that, microtubules, your average neuroscientist
I don't know what a microtubule is.
It's something inside the cell wall of a neuron.
It's a microtube.
That Roger Penrose...
It's a tiny tubule. Let's look up what microtubule is. Microtubules. Microtubules are hollow, rigid tubes that are a key part of the cytoskeleton and eukaryotic cells. They're responsible for many cellular functions, help determine the shape of a cell. Is there an image we can look at? Yeah, they're like these little little hoses, I guess. Interesting. What else do they do? Microtubules are involved in cell locomotion and the movement of organelles. Microtubules help chromosomes move. Microtubules are a major component of cilia and flagella. They must be super fucking tiny. All right, that's not super helpful.
Dude, I know this.
So quantum computing in the brain, basically.
Oh, okay.
And this was going to be wave function collapse in microtubules was going to be responsible
Plus,
for
I think the fundamental feature of quantum physics is the probabilistic nature of the reality that it underpins. And so it would allow you even possibly to have a perception of free will, because there's a probabilistic firing of neurons, right, triggered by this quantum wave function. Okay. So that's as I understood it. I hope I didn't.
So is that the brain as kind of a prediction machine, or is that just really
for Penrose? The biggest thing was he thought the human mathematicians can do things that no computer could ever do, and he used Gödel's theorem that no formal system can ever be complete and consistent to argue for that point. And he made a philosophical argument for why we have to do these special. And then he said, therefore, we need new physics that goes beyond anything computable. And he said, let's look to a theory of quantum gravity. And now we're getting to Neil's territory.
Right.
So Gödel studied the system of definitions that comprise math. Okay. It turns out it applies to much more than math if you really think about it.
It also applies to keeping your belly nice and flat. Sorry, that's a different Gödel.
We know that 1 + 1 is 2, and 2 + 2 is 4.
Right.
And there are rules that get you there. Okay. So you can ask, can mathematics be constructed as a completely self-consistent set of rules?
Okay.
Where any rule has a rule before it that is consistent with the other rules. Can you do this? And he concluded, and it's not just because he pulled it out of his ass, he can show that at some point in mathematics, you just have to make something up and declare it to be true, and you have no ability to prove that it's true.
Okay.
You have to assert it. And out of that comes the rest of everything else.
Oh, wow.
And so this was shocking. Because something with
This is not about consciousness. This is about the philosophy of math and the philosophy of science. It's not really related.
The logic of mathematics,
related,
yeah, this proves that, and this is only true because I can prove it. You keep doing that all the way down, you reach a point where somebody's just sitting there up on the throne saying, "This is so."
So let it be written. So let it be done.
Exactly. That has to happen at some point for all the rest. You know who also did this? You must know this. The color people. Okay.
What colored people?
No, I didn't
no
say
D on the end?
Oh, I'm sorry.
There was no.
I was going to say, what black mathematician did this?
So we can say what color is the gentleman's shirt.
Okay.
As we've decided.
As we decided.
Fishy
And
pink.
I said it's the color of
King salmon.
King salmon. Well, what color is the color of king salmon?
The king salmon.
No, then you're going to say it's kind of like, let's say it was bluish. You say it was kind of violet. Well, what color is violet? And then you can go to like the flower that's violet.
That's a violet.
Okay, that's a violet. Well, what color is that? Right? You keep doing this, and you reach a point where somebody just has to declare it.
You cannot reduce it any further.
You cannot reduce it. You just have to declare.
You got to just say this is
we agree that this is red, and then you take it from there.
And both Penrose and the color people think that the people who study
Pronounce
color
that more cleanly, because we got. Otherwise, look, Chuck will come upside your ass.
So Penrose and the Negroes,
Colored people.
they're decided.
the vision scientists who study color
Oh, there you go.
and the mathematicians who think about consistency and completeness both sometimes end up at this point where they argue there is something special about human consciousness. Humans can have insights into seeing that some mathematical theorem is true. Penrose thought in a way that no machine could know. The people who study color say through studying the visual processes in the brain that process colors, you could study all that and it still won't tell you what the experience of the color of king salmon is like.
I think it's interesting that they're talking about the underlying assumptions and baselines for reductionist scientific theories and math, and I just think that, like, when it comes to color science is actually very well developed and understood, and color as a spectrum of wavelengths, and part of the electromagnetic spectrum, I think is what it is. I'll have to look that up to make sure I'm saying that right. But that's actually pretty well known, and the idea that when a particular wavelength goes into my eye, and it's the same wavelength that goes into your eye, and the same wavelength that goes into everybody's eyes, is perceived similarly, and we can communicate that in a shared way, and we all can agree that colors are colors. I don't think that's very controversial, and I don't think it's the best example of why consciousness is difficult. I think it's interesting when people worry about, is the color you see the same color I see? And there's no evidence that the colors are differently perceived in mass that I can see, other than in colorblind people, which there's obviously like a physical reason that they are seeing that their brain is interpreting wavelengths differently. But but there's nothing particularly controversial when somebody says something is green or something is blue. They tend to agree on those things, and the combinations of colors that generate the mass differences in colors is not weird or complex, or at least not understood. As opposed, also at some point you have to come up with names for things, and names immediately single things out. And I don't know how you would have a system that doesn't have. I don't know how you would have a shared system where you don't just simply say at some point, this is blue. This wavelength is blue, it looks like blue, and then there's the massive gradations and fluctuations in what we would all call different types of blue and different shades. At some point you just have to start somewhere, and I don't think that that's inconsistent or illogical. It is logic. The reason there's a 1 is because of we have to agree that there's a difference between 1 and another 1. Maybe.
That is something you have to know subjectively.
Oh,
The feeling of
that's
the color.
what they're saying, because the color affects you, and that effect will be different. You cannot know that unless you actually experience it yourself.
Subjective experience.
The subjective
you have to have had the experience.
I'm affected by the blues and the greens in Van Gogh's Starry Night.
Okay.
But now he's conflating consciousness with emotions. Just because consciousness isn't just feelings, it's subjective experiences, which can involve feelings, it can involve words, and it can involve associations, and it can involve reactions and all sorts of things. But it isn't solely an emotional experience to be conscious. Consciousness is more complex than that.
I feel those colors.
You feel those colors.
And if you just read a book about it, or if you just
wouldn't do anything.
You looked at an image of your brain processing all this, that would not give you the experience of Starry Night.
If it's going to take different thinking, because we've spent thousands of years thinking in a certain way, and if you want an analog linear manner, what theories are out there right now that are thinking differently and are looking like they might challenge this hard problem?
You know, there's no consensus on this, but one radical view on the kind of the reductionist side of the equation is to say there actually is no such thing as consciousness. It's all an illusion generated by the brain.
I'm in that
Our
camp.
brain makes us think that we have these special properties, and nothing actually has them.
I'm in that camp.
Oh, my beard sucks.
Whoa.
I'm just gonna shave it.
Whoa.
You're acting crazy.
One of the main reasons men are embarrassed.
For no reason.
Nobody cares.
I'm just thinking, maybe we're all dancing around something that doesn't really exist.
See, what I don't like about this, it's, I guess, epistemological to contemplate what is real and what isn't real, and they're going to go into what reality is here soon. But if you're defining consciousness as subjective experience, and you agree that we have subjective experiences, then it's real as much as any concept can be real, because you just said that we have them, we agree. Now, whether that conscious experience is reducible to some known internal firings and mechanisms is the question that science is trying to figure out. But the idea that it isn't real is not the same as other illusions and other magical or non-physical thinking, like the concept of ghosts or something, because we now maybe they're saying we don't have subjective experience and therefore we don't have consciousness, but they all just agreed that we have subjective experiences. So I don't understand the concept of it doesn't exist. Then what would you call the internal process that I can communicate to others and that I definitely am having? Like, I'm definitely communicating with myself internally, and that has a name, and that name is consciousness. And so I think it's odd to say that it doesn't exist. Now, what it may not be is it may not be something that is easily understood or easily reducible or easily located physically. But because I believe things are physical, or because I believe in the physical world as the way that I conceptualize everything, is there's something physical and mechanistic about it, then I don't see why it would be an illusion or why it wouldn't be real. Now, free will is a much more complex concept because of its definition. Free will's definition is very complicated, and I think that might be more what they're talking about, is they're getting into the usefulness of consciousness, or consciousness, the ability of consciousness to affect the world. That's a different concept. It could be that we're just passively observing things, and then we do things, and then we observe that, but the observing part has no feedback loop to the real world. It's just enclosed and jailed by its lack of agency. But I believe in free will, so to me that's it's not illusory, especially if you're just going to say that it's a subjective experience. I think we definitely have subjective experiences, and they're very difficult to prove, I suppose.
And then maybe it's just we want to believe there's this special thing to make us seem special.
So what's driving that? Is that the sort of 1,000 brains theory that Hawkins has?
What is that? What is that, 1,000 brains?
Please, you're
I don't
more
know the 1,000 brains.
Oh, it's kind of like a cognitive mechanism. Hawkins came up, Jeff Hawkins apparently.
Oh, Jeff Hawkins, okay,
came up
yeah.
with 1,000 brains, where it's not just one singular brain that's doing this, but these are the compartments within the brain. I might be doing a disservice to his theory here, probably am. Sorry.
Are you talking about the construction of the brain itself? Yeah. So like inside your brain are just these multiple layers of brain.
Yeah.
And somehow they all come together is what gives you the consciousness.
Models within models. The brain has models of the brain, and it may be a misleading model of the brain.
I mean, is it this dark space that's occupying up there, and we shine a light because that's the thing we need to look at right now, because it's not a Rolodex. I know that for sure. So where is it and how is it? And so does it then exist as we're thinking?
Well, the brain builds very simple models of the world. You know, maybe it models physics of the world with a folk physics, which is way simpler and different from actual physics.
You say folk physics?
Yeah, like common sense physics. It's like you know, Aristotle's physics, things like impetus and so on that may not.
Heavy things fall faster
exist.
than lighter things because they're heavier.
I was about to say
some of that is wrong.
But Aristotle was kind of stupid.
Yeah.
very smart.
No, I'm joking. He's a smart guy.
Aristotle got hardly any physics correct.
No one was going to get it right the first time.
In physics, if someone makes a measurement and gets a result, and then someone else makes the same measurement, but gets a different result. And someone gets a different machine to try to measure the same phenomenon, and they yet get a different result. But everybody thinks there's a result, but none of the results agree. That's usually evidence of no phenomenon at all. And people are pulling things out of the noise of the data when there's no agreement. And so what leads me to think maybe consciousness doesn't really exist in any way anyone thinks is because everybody's idea about consciousness is different and does not comport and does not blend into a greater edifice of an understanding of consciousness, which leads me in this example of physics to possibly think that there's no such thing as consciousness and we're just dancing around a maypole and the pole is not even there.
Well, I said it's early days, but I also think there is a core of phenomena on which people agree, on which we have data.
That's good to know.
Coming out of the neuroscience,
Okay.
there's phenomena like, blind sight, where people can identify an object without consciousness, forms of contrast between conscious and unconscious perception, experiments on neural correlates of consciousness. The trouble is the agreement is not yet on the wild fundamental theory. Maybe that's not happening for another 50 years or 100 years. Who's to say?
Right.
But there's the beginnings of a science there. There are things we can agree on. And the neuroscientists tend to be conservative about this stuff. Mostly they're not the ones writing the book that says, here's my solution
Here is
to the problem.
Right.
They say, let's build it up a piece at a time and we'll eventually get there.
And in all fairness, you're in a very new field compared to other branches of science. We have the benefit of 6 centuries of births of smart people, which includes Galileo, who died the same year Newton was born.
Right.
And so Newton, we had Einstein, we had the benefit of smart people.
Platforms upon which to build.
Over the centuries. And if you're just all coming at it now.
Yeah, let's do our conservative science and let's also build some speculation on top of it. But
I think that the only way you get to understand new theories is by studying them and putting effort into them. And the ultimate goal of trying to learn about what consciousness is, I suppose, is just to understand probably how to manipulate it, which may or may not be good, or how to simulate it. It's kind of one of those theories that doesn't have a immediate practical effect, but once we understand it and know more about it, then maybe the output of the theory will be different. Also, they talked about that consciousness might arise out of the different components of the brain, and maybe it isn't one singular portion, but I think that seems fairly obvious in that the brain does have compartments and it analyzes things differently. Also, what I think is a really important and interesting facet of neurology is the brain hemispheres, the 2 brain hemispheres, and how they communicate with each other. And I think that more research into that will help us understand our ability to have internal dialogues and our ability to compartmentalize and model the world in different ways, in some ways more logical and in some ways more abstract. I think that those systems are developed and differentiated out of necessity, like with a computer, because you need different modules to do different systems if you're going to do things simultaneously. And in order to understand and live in the world and survive, we need to be able to take in lots of information and process internal information as well, and we need to be able to do it all right now so that we don't die right now. And consciousness emerges out of a necessity to solidify many systems into a coherent uh, a coherent and highly edited um, mechanism in which we can strain out unimportant information and focus on things that are relevant. And so I think looking at it like there's multiple systems involved in the brain, and those are being affected by other things in the body, I think are pretty important. It's a holistic approach to consciousness. Consciousness is unlikely to be found in like one cell or one clump of cells, because it would be very vulnerable, and because it seems like it's a emergent property. It's diffused over many systems, I think.
Let's realize that right now it is speculation.
Good. Thank you.
Okay.
We'll
All right.
speculate that if there is quantum mechanics in the consciousness, that we're connected to the universe with our consciousness.
With our wave functions.
That is totally a speculation, but
I
these
know.
speculations are great to think about. I'm a philosopher. I get paid to speculate. So it's like,
Good for you.
hey, this is,
Really?
let's think about all
They
these
pay you for
ideas. Yeah, they do. I don't need to perform
How do I
any
get that?
experiments except for thought experiments.
That's so
They pay
cool.
me for thought
Wait, did your
experiments.
parents say he wants to be a philosopher? How's he going to pay his rent?
Thought experiments.
I'm a philosopher. Did you bullshit today? Did you think about bullshitting today?
There's the old joke about the dean who said, why at the physics department? Why are you more like the math department? All they need is pens, papers, and trash cans. Or he could be like the philosophy department. All they need is pens and paper.
Really
That's
good.
a great joke.
I love that.
All right,
I love that.
So if we detach from consciousness just for the moment, I go back to Descartes, almost 1650 or whatever, is questioning the reality outside of himself, and throw it into the future and ask, if reality, is not virtual reality real, whatever real may be?
I think that at this point they go into virtual reality and the future of reality. They talk about like living in the metaverse and doing all that. That doesn't relate to the idea of understanding consciousness itself. I mean, if consciousness is a matter of, or is part of the benefit of consciousness is that it models the world, then your reality is encased and identified and created, and it depends on what you mean by reality. If reality is what's out, what exists, regardless of whether I interpret it properly, or if reality is how I perceive the external world, which is dependent on my interpretation, or if reality is simulation. They talk about simulation, but I didn't want to comment on all of that particularly. I just wanted to put in some thoughts about consciousness itself, its definition. I don't understand why when people talk about consciousness, they're not adding and talking about internal dialogues, internal thinking, internal linguistic, internal conversations. Maybe I overemphasize the importance of the internal dialogues that I have, and that's why I think that that's a huge aspect of consciousness, even when in altered states of consciousness, like in a dream or on mushrooms, there is still a linguistic, verbal set of markers that arise and that are codifying the experience. And that codifying representative modeling process that goes on internally is a huge aspect of what I consider consciousness. And so, because I think that's one of the biggest aspects, that should be, I think, one of the things that people talk about and one of the things that they study. And I don't know that they mentioned internal representations language at all. And that's why I don't know that you can come up with a proper definition of it without talking about internal representations. And as humans, we have just this very complex verbal linguistic capability, and I think that all stems from the ability to create visual models of the world that allow you to predict the future and allow you to understand cause and effect to a degree that is adaptive and allows you to survive. But it seems like they're mostly concentrating on I don't know, the current research and the current frameworks that are being introduced when it comes to consciousness. And then they bring up a lot of different things like intelligence and potentially free will and reality. And those are peripheral to consciousness because everything is peripheral to consciousness. Consciousness is the way that we interpret the world, or it is a aspect of how we interpret the world. It isn't the entirety of the interpretation, but it's how we sort of one of the things that humans do that a lot of other animals don't do is we have written and recorded language, and the positive feedback loop that comes from inventing that system and by expanding on that system, I think is why we're super successful, because of that ability to have shared language systems, shared representation systems like math and language and drawing and spatial representations. We can plan and understand mechanisms in the world that allow us to predict the weather, predict the future, predict the actions of animals, and to make experimentations and review them. So I think that's a huge advantage. But it doesn't mean that the basis for consciousness isn't available to creatures that are not human and that don't have complex language, because they still have visual representations. They still have models of the world about like where things are and how things act, and they may be super simple, but they are still within the bounds of what I would call consciousness. So anyway, that's going to do it for now. I might talk about virtual reality or something like that in a later commentary, I guess. But yeah, that's it.